Good afternoon. I am Councilmember Zachary Parker, Chair of the Committee on Youth Affairs. Today is Wednesday, March 25th, 2026. The time is now 3:00 p.m., and I'm calling to order this public hearing on B26-0026, the Theatrical Wrestling Regulation Amendment Act of 2025. Today's hearing concerns a subject that may be unfamiliar to some, but has real consequences for communities across the district. Wrestling events have long served as a vehicle for cultural expression and community building, particularly for Black, Latino, and LGBTQ wrestlers and fans. These events are closer in character to theatrical performance than to competitive sport. Match outcomes are typically predetermined, moves are choreographed, and participants are working together in performance, not competing against one another. Under current district law, a small independent wrestling show at a community venue is governed by the same regulatory framework as a championship boxing bout at Capital One Arena. And we will hear testimony today on whether that should remain the case. The result has been that nearly all small independent wrestling events have relocated to Maryland and Virginia. The scene has, for all practical purposes, been pushed out of the district. B26-0026, introduced by my colleague, Councilmember Nadeau, and co-introduced by myself and Councilmember Robert White, seeks to address this issue. This legislation amends the Boxing and Wrestling Commission Act of 1975 to establish theatrical wrestling as a distinct category of event, one defined by its performative, non-competitive nature and limited to smaller venues or festival settings. In doing so, it removes the regulatory requirements that have made it effectively impossible for independent promoters to operate in the district. This legislation is consistent with recent reforms in Washington State and Louisiana, and with longstanding practice in states like Missouri and Virginia. This legislation was originally referred to the Committee on Business and Economic Development, but following committee reorganization in January of this year, the Committee on Youth Affairs now has jurisdiction over the DC Combat Sports Commission. Subsequently, the bill was referred to the Committee on Youth Affairs on March 3rd, 2026. This hearing gives us an important opportunity to examine how our regulatory framework can better serve the full range of events and communities that fall under the Commission's scope. I want to be clear that this effort is not about weakening oversight of genuine competitive combat sports. Rather, it is about ensuring that the Commission's resources and requirements are right-sized appropriately to what is being regulated. I look forward to ensuring that this is the case throughout today's hearing. I want to thank in advance all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm particularly grateful for Chairman Huff for joining us to provide testimony. The committee looks forward to hearing directly from the Commission about how this legislation would interact with existing regulatory operations, and we appreciate Chairman Huff's willingness to engage with us on this question. Before we begin, a few procedural notes. Each witness will have 3 minutes to present your testimony, followed by a 10-minute round of questioning. And given that we have a short list of witnesses, we will likely only have one round of questions. Written testimony may be submitted for the record until April 8th, 2026 at 5:30 p.m. via the Council's hearing management system. And with that, I will call our witnesses for the... Oh, I am sorry. I totally missed the author of this legislation. I will turn to my colleague, Councilmember Nadeau, for opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Chairman. It's tough in that room to tell who's online. In December, Capital One Center hosted over 19,000 fans for John Cena's farewell event, which set a record for the highest grossing WWE event in its history and made it clear that the District of Columbia is a destination for pro wrestling and sports entertainment. At the same time, however, our local performers and promoters have struggled. Despite a long and storied history here, independent pro wrestling in the district has been stifled by regulatory requirements and high costs. These wrestling exhibitions are much closer to theater performance than sport like boxing. Pro wrestling match outcomes are usually predetermined or non-competitive, and moves are choreographed in advance. Even Shakespeare wrote a wrestling scene in As You Like It. This legislation defines theatrical wrestling as its own class of event, acknowledging that it should not be treated in the same way we treat competitive combat sports and larger events. It's also in line with longstanding policy in states like Missouri and Virginia and legislative reforms passed in Washington state and Louisiana. Designation as a theatrical wrestling event would apply only to the performances of mock combat for the purposes of entertainment in venues with a capacity under 2,000. It's my hope we can again see a resurgence in indie wrestling in DC. I don't think that and I want to say for the record that I don't think that simply granting flexibility to the commission is the solution here. We should strive for a streamlined and sensible set of rules that are easy to follow. I've met with Chairman Huff and the Combat Sports Commission when this bill was first introduced, and I've appreciated the chairman's openness to collaborating with the council on determining the right regulatory approach for this type of performance. Chairman Parker, thank you for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses who've come out to testify.
Thank you. I am thrilled and looking forward to today's hearing. I must admit, though, I was a bit disheartened to hear that many of these matches are choreographed. As a diehard wrestling fan growing up, I was convinced that these were really competitive matches.
I am so sorry. I really put my foot in my mouth, didn't I?
No, you're good. No, I had the same conversation with Chairman Huff, and it's just a little disheartening, but nonetheless, impressive. So I think this bill is really important, all jokes aside, and I'm looking forward to today's testimony. With that, I'm going to turn to our public witnesses. We have Billy Dixon, who I believe is virtual, Michael or Mike Hairsign, and Brandon Skull, who I believe is virtual. So. And as a reminder, you will have 3 minutes for your testimony, followed by a round of questions. So when you're ready, Billy, you may give your testimony.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone involved, for your time. My name is Kyle Kiari Dixon, and for 10 years, I've been traveling around this country and performing as Billy Dixon. I am from the South Bronx in New York City. I share a lot of similar experiences and identities with the people of Washington, D.C. I am a proud Black queer performer, and I have spent my career dedicated to uplifting the voices of marginalized people in this space. Unfortunately, my experience with the commission has been very negative as a showrunner and a wrestler. Professional wrestling is theatrical in nature. It's a collaborative stunt show with constant communication. Our goal as performers is to be convincing to the public that our sport is legitimate, even though we all know the outcomes well in advance to our choreographed matches. We have studied and trained for hours and hours on end, learning so many techniques to communicate with each other that the audience wouldn't even notice. There have been times where someone has been legitimately injured, it's been communicated, the performer's been taken care of, and the audience is none the wiser. Unfortunately, this commission has failed to recognize this fact and difference between us and legitimate sports like MMA and boxing. In the history of the sports, we've had performers of all shapes, sizes, and abilities. We've even had one-legged wrestlers, I kid you not. And through our internal systems, we have ensured the communication and safety of performers and patrons alike. In no way throughout my experience with this commission have they aided or made any of these processes easy in my tenure. In all reality, unless we are televised companies like the WWE or AEW, the folks in the commission on site for our modest independent wrestling shows are often late to the events to check us in before the doors open, and they clearly do not want to be there. They're very dismissive and disrespectful to the performers and to the showrunners alike. Can you imagine how embarrassing and unprofessional you seem to be getting a doctor checking you out as the doors open to patrons? That respect is not reciprocal and not equal to our counterparts who work for televised companies. Simply put, the idea of a commission is largely inept to me and massively overregulated for a fake sport that is an art form. Imagine trying to convince David Blaine that he needed to have a commission for his magic show. Imagine trying to tell Monster Trucks that they need a commission. I think you would have a similar lack of understanding and respect. In my own experience, I've been subjected to body shaming and unhelpful critique of my body. If the doctor who is denying my entry to perform, which is essentially a workout, then with that logic, I shouldn't be given access to go to the gym like Planet Fitness to do just that, work out, if I'm so unhealthy. If I'm traveling all over the country weekend after weekend and performing and safely making it home, I don't need somebody to tell me who spent years and years becoming the doctor that I need to lose quote unquote fucking weight. condescendingly, and then hours later, that same doctor marveled at my obese body, perform moves off the top rope, and marvel the crowd. It seems like I was able to convince him that what I did was real, even though I've been practicing this for years and have protected myself and my opponent. I have seen with my own eyes and heard from my confiding colleagues who are not able to be here about the sexual objectification of female performers while they have been taking exams. I have, with my own eyes, witnessed doctors fulfilling exams and observing the events under the influence of alcohol, which seems even more unethical. Maybe they need their own commission to be a commission. I have experienced commission heads at the 11th hour of shows I was co-producing, strong arming insurance sales from brokers states away were terms that made little to no sense to me and my colleagues. These instances have been documented in articles as we try to ask for answers and accountabilities. If there is a need for a commission, and by that I mean a body that simply wants to tax promoters and performers for the privilege of performing, I personally think that aforementioned body should stay as far away from us as possible and let us earn their money that they take from us with as little interference as possible. Similarly to how the state I currently reside in, Virginia, runs their commission, which has, across my travels throughout this great country of ours, has been the best and most reciprocal relationship between wrestling promoters, wrestlers, fans, and the commission. There have been little to no drama
Sorry,
in my
Mr. Dixon.
time.
If you could wrap up, I gave you an extra minute, but if you can share your final thought, and we will have some
Absolutely.
more questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one more paragraph and then I'm done. Independent wrestling is a low earning art form that is more centered about community building than profitability and outpricing with commission fees for essentially community theater. I find it oppressive. In an area that has positively impacted children at risk and families with little to no money from the existential dread that we live in our lifetime, we are pricing out natives from the things that they can have. An affordable wrestling show could be a lifeline. I think that the bill proposed is an excellent compromise and a way to serve the people of Washington, D.C., which is, I would hope, to be the goal of all parties involved today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, and we do have your written testimony. Next, we have Michael Hairsign, or Mike Hairsign. And before I move forward, Kyle, do you prefer Kyle or Billy?
You can call me Kyle.
Kyle. And Michael or Mike?
Either or.
Okay, we're going to go with Michael, as that's what's printed, and you may proceed.
Good afternoon, council members and staff. Thank you for holding this hearing regarding the Theatrical Regulation Amendment Act of 2025. My name is Michael Hairsign, and I'm a career nightlife worker, not a wrestler, despite my aesthetic. The reason that this issue matters to me is because there is an inherent intersection of nightlife, entertainment, and culture that exists. Most who work in nightlife know that we are, barring at new externalities, nearing the bottom of the industry's business cycle in DC, and will be poised to begin moving forward with a more robust nightlife environment in the next 2 to 3 years. Any upswing in the nightlife industry must coincide with more and varied cultural and entertainment opportunities, especially those that have demonstrated viability in the past, but were choked out by onerous overregulation. Reasonable people recognize the risk of professional wrestling, but also recognize that it is made up of predetermined bouts, making it unable to be a combat sport. First, there is no combat, and second, it is not a sport. To involve combat, there must be an intentionality behind striking a blow to overcome another physically. This can't be the case with wrestling, where performers are actively trying to prevent injury to their scripted opponents. To be a sport, the outcome cannot be predetermined. In short, there is a wide gap between combat sports like boxing or mixed martial arts, where the intention is to cause so much physical damage that your opponent cannot stand up, or slows your opponent enough to rack up points from judges through unpulled blows and protecting your opponent from being hurt. Unlike wrestling, where you are protecting your opponent from being hurt and saving energy for a predetermined finish, often with flourishes of energy to the lighter crowd. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing me to testify to this issue today, and I'm always available for any follow-up questions today or in the future.
Thank you for your testimony. And then next we have Brandon Skull. And you appear to be muted.
Hey,
There we
everybody,
go.
how's it going?
Good.
Kyle, great to see you. I'll mention really quickly, you are on the wall of the brewery over here. I chose to sit by here today to show that off, but we're very proud to have hosted the events that we hosted here at the brewery. We've got it up here on the wall with other accolades and articles about the brewery being founded. So with that, I'll start my testimony. Good afternoon, Chairperson Parker and members of the council. My name is Brandon Skull, and I'm the owner of DC Brow Brewing Company. I am writing in strong support of the Theatrical Wrestling Regulation Amendment Act of 2025. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to produce independent professional wrestling events at our facility. These events were not only successful from a business standpoint, but they also created a unique and inclusive community space, bringing together diverse audiences and performers in a way that few other events can. Because of that firsthand experience, I can say with confidence that the current regulatory framework governing these events is far out of proportion with the reality of what they are. Theatrical wrestling is scripted, choreographed entertainment. Safety is a top priority for performers, and the nature of these events is fundamentally different from competitive combat sports like boxing or MMA. And actually, my wife is a 3-time world champion kickboxer who's won titles in Italy as well as Thailand. And I can tell you firsthand, it is very different. Despite that, we were subject to the same regulatory requirements as major prize fights, which include an overwhelming and often unnecessary burden. In practice, this means being required to obtain insurance policies that even our own insurance carrier told us were unnecessary. It meant navigating a complex and costly approval process that added significant financial strain to events that operate on relatively small margins. In one instance, we were contacted shortly before a scheduled event and told that we needed to produce 2 blankly addressed checks and a last-minute insurance policy in order to proceed. But not to worry, the commissioner also had a recommended insurance provider out of Dallas, Texas, who could turn the policy around for me in time for the event to occur for only a small fee of $1,200. We were also told that failure to comply would result in the event being shut down. That kind of last-minute demand put small businesses in an impossible position. It felt less like oversight and more like a form of coercion. We did everything we could to comply because we believed in the value of these events for our business, for the performers, and for the community. Even then, the cumulative weight of the fees, requirements, and uncertainty ultimately made it unsustainable. We were forced to discontinue events that had been providing meaningful post-COVID revenue and drawing people back into shared spaces at a time that really mattered most to us. The legislation is a necessary and long overdue correction, in my opinion, creating a clear distinction between theatrical wrestling and true combat sports, acknowledging the reality of these events and removing barriers that never should have existed in the first place. I strongly support this bill, and I believe it will help bring back a vibrant, creative, and community-driven form of entertainment to the district. Thank you all for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your testimony. And we will now turn to a round of questions. Mr. Skull, I wanted to start with you. You mentioned in your testimony about this instance where you were contacted shortly before an event and told that you had to acquire insurance, but you had to go through a specific vendor out of Texas.
To clarify, I didn't have to go through that vendor out of Texas, but just being, less than 24 hours before the event or around 24 hours before the event to get insurance was really hard starting from scratch. I tried to find a similar policy other places, and I indeed contacted my own insurance purveyor, for which I have a very robust policy, and was told by them that they didn't even understand the policy that was sent to them to review. I was given an example of a policy that didn't really add up to what I was being asked to produce. And basically it was a very streamlined, quick, easy solution was provided to me through this purveyor in Texas.
Understood. But in addition to the insurance you already have, you were being required to take out more insurance for this event.
That's correct.
And given all of the events that you've hosted, was this the one time that that's happened, or are you required to have that additional insurance for every event?
I haven't had that additional insurance for any other event. And the only times I've had it was the multiple times that I produced the wrestling events.
Understood. So every time, I got it. Okay.
And it was for a relatively small coverage of, I think, about $10,000, payout.
Understood. What I imagine we're going to hear from Mr. Huff, or Chairman Huff, is that safety is paramount. And so how would you respond to that? That by reducing regulations and insurance requirements, for instance, puts the entertainers at risk, but also you as a business owner at risk?
I understand that. My response would be that these events do not require the same sort of insurance as full contact sports events where there is actually the intent to harm the other opponent. These are, as we've all sort of mentioned, more of a theatrical display. In addition to that, the event insurance that I currently have through my current policy had a much larger, I'm saying the word payout, but that's not what I want here. Much larger compensation in the event of an incident than this policy did, and would have been more helpful, in my opinion. Now, if I was throwing a true boxing match or a mixed martial arts event here, this insurance policy probably would have made more sense. However, at the time, the commissioner was having and I'm not referring to Commissioner Huff here, by the way, was having a hard time really explaining to me the exact policy I needed. Tried to send me an example, which didn't make sense to my insurance company. My insurance company kept saying the coverage that we have is far superior to this, and for a much greater amount of coverage that you are already paying for just through the operation of your business and for the events that you already are covered for on site.
Understood. And did you ever figure out where those blank checks were going?
No, and I did not send the blank checks because my accountant would be very upset with me if I issued checks that were not addressed to anybody.
Understood.
They were supposed to be going to, I believe, commissioners who were coming to the event, but they didn't know who they were going to be at that moment or something like that.
As in you had to pay the commissioner to come to the event?
The commissioner or the officials, there was about 6 checks that I was to write that day for people who are coming to supervise the event.
Got it. And is that standard?
To my knowledge, it's standard, but the only time I've ever done this would be in regard to these events.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harrison, I wanted to come to you. You are, I would say, a wrestler or entertainer in the sense of what we're talking about based on your testimony.
No, not a wrestler.
Okay, maybe
I work in nightlife.
Okay, I got that part, but I
Yeah.
thought you were saying that you had actually.
Oh no,
owned
I
this event.
just look like a wrestler. That's all.
That was okay. I missed that part. Similarly, I would ask you, how would you respond to the concerns around safety posed to the entertainers in these matches?
I mean, obviously there are going to be safety concerns, but that's not going to be dissimilar from other events that you do. I mean, if you have a theatrical production of, say, Sweeney Todd, you're going to have trapdoors that are involved. You're going to have a lot more mechanisms beyond 2 individuals who know their own bodies, who have worked with each other before. And you have the possibility to have an accident. If I'm at work, there's a possibility to have an accident. If Brandon's working on the canning line, there's the possibility to have an accident. No matter what you do, if you're doing anything physical, there's always the opportunity for an accident. And I think that, elevating that is not necessarily realistic. I've done landscaping in the past. I've climbed trees, cut down trees. There's always chance for an accident. I think that having that extra layer to cover the same thing as 2 people very intentionally trying to cause each other bodily harm versus a theatrical performance is a very wide gap, right? Even if it's a points result in boxing. You still have somebody who's trying to slow somebody down with body blows, slow somebody down by causing them physical harm. The intention of physical harm exists within combat sports. The avoidance of physical harm exists in independent theatrical wrestling.
But you acknowledge there's inherent risk.
There's inherent risk when I took the Metro to come here today, sir. Like, I mean, there's always inherent risk. I walked by a construction site, something could happen. I use a trash compactor at the end of the night, something could happen. There's 1,000 inherent risks to anything that you do. I don't think that having the same high bar that combat sports has makes sense for a theatrical performance.
Understood. And just very quickly, you made the connection between nightlife and these events that are put on. Can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. Anytime you have an artistic performance, you allow the opportunity for venues to take advantage of them, to promote them, to allow them to get sort of that crux access point to people. If DC didn't have a punk scene, we wouldn't have a Black Cat or a 930 Club. We wouldn't have the Anthem. You know, if we choke out these art forms that might be less than popular to everybody else in the room, we deny the opportunity for that to grow.
Understood. And then I wanted to end, Mr. Dixon, really concerning testimony on a number of fronts. And I just wanted to go through some of the things that you shared in terms of just a lack of professionalism, late notice, late screenings, sexual harassment that you've heard about from other colleagues. Are these complaints documented anywhere outside of your testimony, or like have police complaints or formal complaints to the commission been made?
I do not believe that any formal complaints have been filed. To the best of my knowledge, I think the most documentation that has been done in terms of complaints has been through the few articles that have covered, the rising tensions between performers and the commission.
Understood. And if this bill were to pass, what do you think would be the outcome for wrestlers or entertainers like yourself?
Nothing but positive, a huge net positive. Um, a lot of the performers that are on these shows are local to the area. And there's a lot of children that go to these events and they see themselves in the crowd. There's a huge cultural benefit to many of the children who are in disenfranchised areas because independent wrestling is largely affordable. And, in 2026, our ticket prices are still like sub $20. We don't really do well with inflation and getting people to come. So we are accessible. And I think that promotes community events for the audience, for the wrestlers. It provides them with a place to practice their art, their craft, and to be celebrated. It's like any other kind of career field. Not everybody will grow up to be the president of the United States, to be Beyonce winning a Grammy, but there are people who get to have their moments in smaller sectors of each field that they go into. I think the benefit for the wrestlers is that they get to make additional income. A little aside about me is that during the pandemic, when wrestling was kind of put on hold, I did run. Sorry, the term is close set. Sorry, close set productions with an abundance of protocols and conferring with doctors at the time, so that people could get employment that came out of my own personal savings account, because my passion for the art form is that deep. And I think when we were able to run events again and the turnouts were so crazy and we sold out so fast, it helped the wrestlers use the performances to acquire bookings in other states and other regions of the country, and of course provide to the culture in DC.
Understood. Have you ever been injured?
Yes, I have been injured in my wrestling career. The first injury I ever sustained was in training when I was learning something new and landed wrong, and I broke my entire right arm. My best friend, who I was learning the move with, noticed that something was wrong. Said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I think my arm's out of place," and he escorted me to the hospital, and I was able to get checked out and get a cast. I have not been injured in a wrestling match in my career. I'm very grateful for that. Uh, but that's the only time I can recall sustaining an injury in a ring.
And final question, what would you say in response to the notion that there's inherent risk, even though this is not a combative sport per se, but in these theatrical events, and therefore the regulations are there to keep you safe? What would be your response?
Well, I would first ask the professionals that work in the commission if they know how to apply a headlock safely. What is the rubric that they can apply a knowledge and an assessment of safety onto me outside of a vital? For example, there is a way to do and to not do other maneuvers that we have spent years learning and perfecting. um, I think when you talk about risk, like it was mentioned earlier, there's inherent risk doing anything all day. If you cook dinner, there's a chance that hot water you're boiling to make rice boils over and burns you and get third-degree burns. That happened to me when I was 21 years old.
I got it. I got it. So, and then I wanted, I know I'm at time, but Mr. Skull, I wanted to come back to you and just, can you touch on the competition piece that having these events in DC is becoming harder per the testimony because there is greater competition from Maryland and Virginia given these regulations and the price, et cetera, as well as it's just difficult securing venues and the such. Can you just speak to that as someone that is putting on these events?
Sure. So, I mean, the way the events originally came to us was a promoter wanted to bring these events back into DC. And I guess there was some in Virginia and Maryland at the time. And when we, produced the first event, I learned that there was apparently some beef between like the boxing commission and wrestling or something. I was totally unaware of it, but what I saw firsthand through putting it on, I could tell right away, like something isn't right here. I don't know what it is coming into it as that being my first experience. I wasn't sure, but I could tell that there was some sort of friction. And we continue to push forward and try to do a few more. But the reason we ended up really having to stop doing them is because the performers and the promoter who is helping us to put on the events just said, we just can't do this anymore. We've been too disrespected by the commission, and there's too many loopholes for us to jump through, and we just can't do it. And we would have kept doing it, but really the talent sort of said we are not going to subject ourselves to this anymore. So at that point, we lost the ability to continue doing the events. And I did see them go into Virginia and Maryland. And, I think that there's always going to be an audience for an art form like this. There's always going to be an audience because it is beautiful. It's novel. The way that the performers address social and political issues is so creative and enthralling. People are always going to be pulled into it. And I think the district is losing a vital form of expression as these events go into Maryland and Virginia, or I should say go back to Maryland and Virginia. For us, the losing the ability to produce events that brought a lot of people out to the brewery and helped us to generate funds in the post-COVID world. That was a really big loss. These were some of the best attended events that we've ever put on, quite frankly. The community support and involvement for them is incredible and inspiring. And I would love for the chance to go back to putting some of these on. It is a really love-filled, friendly community. You only see the act up on stage, but Backstage, everybody is like best friends. It's all hugs and, you know, everybody's in awe of everybody and what the other performers are doing. And I would love the opportunity to bring that back and do it at our little brewery over here.
Can you say more about the treatment? We heard from Mr. Dixon about the treatment with the commission, and you're alluding to that as well. The
Yeah.
unprofessional treatment that the entertainers are receiving.
Yeah, I witnessed it firsthand. You know, I saw a lot of like jokes cracked. I saw people being asked to produce very personal things in public settings that you would never, you know, suspect someone to produce. Very sensitive blood paperwork, let's say, in an area where the public could hear, things like that, that would be very personal to somebody. And just sort of a general disregard for that performer. And I definitely wondered if this was a boxer or if this was, you know, a mixed martial arts fighter, would they be treated the same way? But definitely a lack of seriousness, I would say. And I saw, not firsthand witnessing what happened, but being in the green room, I saw many wrestlers come back very distraught, disturbed, and offended about what had occurred, you know, where they were checking in.
And Mr. Dixon, you alluded to some of this where there were comments about your weight and other things.
Yes, that is something that I did experience.
When these moments happen, what action do you feel like you can take, or is there somewhere you can report what's happening?
You know, I'll be very honest. When all of this happened, I was much younger. I was in my very early 20s. So, you know, with that kind of time in life and mindset, did I go looking for a form on the internet to file a formal complaint? I did not. I just thought that this was part of that storied combative history between these two entities. And I thought it was just something that I had to deal with. Now that I'm 30 years old and know a lot more because of life experience, I would go about it a different channel. But that was just what I was going through. But yes, there were many comments about, you know, my body and in terms of what that meant for my health or what I could or could not do.
Understood. And in no way was I suggesting you were at fault, but I'm just trying. These anecdotes are a bit concerning to me, and I'm hearing them across witnesses and just trying to see where there might be a paper trail of sorts that we can track this down. But I certainly will bring it up with the chairman. And, you know, I would say on behalf of district government, I apologize that folks are having to go through this, because you don't deserve this, Mr. Dixon, but also Mr. Skoll, the entertainers that are doing this either for a living or for fun don't deserve this. So I will be sure to follow up on that.
I will also add, none of that came from Chairman Huff.
Same here.
I found him to be very respectful. I found him to be very understanding and genuinely working towards trying to find a solution to everything.
That is fair. Do you happen to know who those comments were made by? And you can always share them offline if
I'll share them offline. I do have some emails and anecdotes and things like that I can share with you offline.
That would be really helpful. Okay. Thank you all for your testimony. We are now going to move to our government witness, which is Andrew Huff, the chairman of the Combat Sports Commission. And Mr. Huff, if you can, while you're up, raise your right hand. And I have a script that I'm supposed to read, and so I'm not going to mess this up. It is the practice of this committee to place our government witnesses under oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to provide to the Committee on Youth Affairs is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Thank you. And you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Parker, members of the Committee on Youth Affairs, and staff. My name is Andrew Huff. I am the chair of the DC Combat Sports Commission. The commission regulates boxing, professional wrestling, kickboxing, and mixed martial arts in the District of Columbia, and protects both participants and consumers by enforcing the district's combat sports laws and regulations. The commission consists of 5 volunteer members who are nominated by the mayor and confirmed by the council. In addition to myself, the commission includes Kimberly Lockett, Sean Townsend, and Chris Jenkins. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding Bill 26-0026, the Theatrical Wrestling Regulation Amendment Act of 2025. As stated, this bill would amend the Boxing and Wrestling Commission Act of 1975 to update its exemptions, including establishing an exemption for a new class of combat sports, theatrical wrestling. The bill would also add the term theatrical wrestling to the act, defining it in part as sports entertainment that, quote, takes place in a venue with a total audience capacity of fewer than 2,000 attendees or as part of a festival or other special event, end quote. The commission supports the intent of this bill, which is ultimately to reduce the barriers to independent professional wrestling events in the district. And we welcome the opportunity to work with the council, the community, and our industry partners to continue to support these events. In addition to regulating combat sports and protecting both participants and consumers, commission members also act as unofficial ambassadors for combat sporting events in the district. Last year, I provided written testimony in support of legislation to designate the district as the official sports capital of the United States. And the commission looks forward to working with Events DC and district government in attracting and retaining sporting events, including professional wrestling. Councilmember Nadeau mentioned the John Cena event down at the Capital One Arena, set a new gate record, as she mentioned, and was an incredible revenue generator for the city. And that's a shout out to Angie Gates and her team at Events DC for bringing that show to town. The council and the commission are aligned in our desire to ease barriers to combat sporting events. The commission strives to encourage these events, including independent wrestling, while also protecting the safety and well-being of participants and attendees. To that end, the commission has modified the medical requirements for a professional wrestling license. Whereas wrestlers were previously required to submit medical paperwork to the commission every 6 months, they now must do so only annually, thereby reducing the administrative and financial burden on wrestlers while continuing to protect health and safety. The commission has also lowered the licensing fees to ease the financial strain of holding independent wrestling events in the district. It has lowered the fee for a promoter's license to $130 to help attract promoters and support smaller promotions. This is lower than the fee charged by Maryland and Virginia, $150 and $500 respectively. Also, during my time as chair, the commission has reduced the fee for a professional wrestler's license from $200 to $25. This is more aligned with Maryland and Virginia's fees, which are $10 and $40 respectively. While the commission does support the intent of this legislation, we do have several concerns about the bill as currently drafted. First, the legislation would create a new combat sports event, theatrical wrestling, and exempt it from the oversight of the commission. Theatrical wrestling is simply another way of referring to professional wrestling. This would also be inconsistent with Maryland and Virginia. Both states recognize professional wrestling, not theatrical wrestling. Maryland licenses professional wrestlers. Virginia licenses wrestlers and permits wrestling events. These inconsistencies could hinder future commission efforts to adopt licensure by endorsement and could limit the professional mobility of licensed wrestlers. Second, the legislation would exempt professional wrestling that takes place at a venue with a total audience capacity of fewer than 2,000 attendees from commission oversight. However, venue and crowd size do not alter the very real health and safety dangers that wrestlers face in the ring. There are well-known and inherent dangers when an individual jumps 10 feet in the air from a turnbuckle onto a concrete floor a set of wooden slats, and other people. Larger wrestling promotions like World Wrestling Entertainment and All Elite Wrestling have a traveling medical and training staff, which helps to mitigate many health and safety risks. At the independent level, however, wrestlers are responsible for their own health and fitness, making it even more important that commission licensed doctors examine wrestlers pre-event and ensure the availability of emergency medical services on site during the event. Venue and crowd size also do not alter the consumer protections that attendees of wrestling events should be afforded. Tickets for all wrestling events, regardless of size, should include the price, name of the promoter, date, and place of the event. This bill would not require tickets at smaller events to do this and would thus diminish certain protections for consumers. In addition to the concerns about the impact of deregulating small venue events on both wrestlers and consumers, recent actions taken by the Commission make the bill's proposed exemption of wrestling that takes part as part of, quote, a festival or special event, unquote, unnecessary. The Commission has updated these requirements regarding licensing for wrestling taking place at a festival or special event. Under these new requirements, wrestling at such an event only requires a District of Columbia wrestler's license instead of both a wrestling and promoter's license. Accordingly, the Commission would advise removing this requirement from the existing bill to avoid any confusion or duplication, as our recent regulatory actions strike the appropriate balance between wrestler safety and reducing costs and administrative burden. The Commission is amenable to easing burdens to combat sporting events, including independent wrestling in the district. My testimony identifies a few changes that have been made to modify the medical requirements and licensing fees for professional wrestlers and wrestling. The Commission is in constant contact with our stakeholders across the District of Columbia and the combat sports industry, including promoters, and will continue to make changes that do not compromise the health and safety of participants and attendees. I would again like to thank the committee for allowing me to testify. The Commission looks forward to working with the committee on this and other efforts. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Huff. As part of your testimony, you make the argument that theatrical wrestling is simply professional wrestling. And so is there no distinction in your mind or amateur smaller scale event wrestling versus the John Cena event that happened at Capital One Arena?
There's not. It's professional wrestling on a smaller scale, and by an independent promoter as opposed to a large company or corporation.
So in principle, you just take issue with the exemption that there's a carve out that seems to delineate a type of professional wrestling, because in your mind or in the Commission's mind, it's all the same thing.
Correct. Professional wrestling.
And that's largely per your argument because the risk factor is the same, whether you're in a 40,000 seat arena or in a 1,000-foot room or seat room.
Correct. And I would even go a step further and say that in some cases, it may be more dangerous at an independent level because of the fact that a lot of those athletes, you know, this is not what they do all day, every day, and they don't have the benefit of a training staff and a medical staff to follow them, you know, throughout their career.
Understood. You talked about and highlighted some aspects of comparison between DC and our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Notably, the promoter license, you highlighted DC is at $130 compared to $150 and $500 respectively. Also, the wrestling license is now $25 compared to $10 and $40 respectively. Does DC align with our neighbors on other aspects of regulations outside of those two?
I would say generally speaking, yes. There's nothing that is so outlandish or out of line about the district's regulations that would necessarily drive a promoter to Virginia or Maryland. outside of the purview of this commission, there are very real issues around affordability of small venues. That's not something that's in our purview or under our control by any means. But like I said, we act also as unofficial ambassadors to the sport. So we're always talking to different people. And a lot of times promoters, not necessarily for wrestling shows, but for boxing shows, will ask us, like, where can we do a show that's not Capital One Arena? And there are some, but it's not cheap.
And would that, in your mind, be one of the main reasons why a vendor would go to Maryland and Virginia versus DC, the venue cost?
I believe so. I believe that is one of the driving factors.
What are some of the factors that make DC more attractive than our neighboring jurisdictions?
Well, I think by the very fact that we're DC, I think it's a lot cooler to put on a wrestling show in DC than it is in Virginia. I'm from Virginia, so no offense to anybody from Virginia or Maryland. But you know, like both Billy and Brandon alluded to, there's a history of professional wrestling in the district that makes it stand out a little bit. The first televised wrestling match occurred in Washington, D.C. And Vince McMahon Sr.'s Worldwide Wrestling Federation was headquartered here. It was
Those were the days I was watching
right. Me too.
wrestling.
Me too.
Again, this is there's an element of nostalgia here, but let me just stay on task. I totally understand why DC would be more attractive. I also get the barriers that exist, namely in terms of venues and costs that might drive a vendor elsewhere.
Mhm.
On the wrestling license, what does one have to do to obtain a wrestling license?
They have to fill out a license application, which includes basic information that you would fill out for any sort of license, whether you're a barber or a funeral director. You have to have an annual physical examination by a licensed physician, which includes blood work, mainly for HIV, hepatitis C. That piece is for the performer's protection, but also you know, to protect the consumer. It's not unheard of at a wrestling show for a wrestler to bleed. Sometimes it's done intentionally, sometimes it's unintentional. You know, we want to make sure that the folks that are attending the show aren't exposed to a bloodborne illness. So blood work is a part of the medical.
And is it to say that, let's say that blood test came back and showed that there were signs of various illnesses, would that preclude someone from receiving?
Most likely.
Even if they are being treated?
That's a good question. I've been on the commission for 10 years. I've been the chair for the past 2, and we've never encountered that. So I don't have an answer to that, but I'd be happy to
And
get
so
back to you.
I guess underneath one of your concerns there is that if we reduce certain restrictions, there will be less oversight into the health of the entertainers themselves, which poses risks to other entertainers, but also attendees at these events.
Potentially, yeah. Our main charge is around the health and safety of the participants, excuse me, and the attendees. That is why we exist.
In your testimony, you also spoke about consumer protections. And so when an attendee signs up for one of these performances, they should know who's hosting it, where is it going to be, et cetera. How are those protections enforced by DLCP?
The commission staff.
So walk me through that. So right now, every event would have those consumer protection details provided, date, host, details, et cetera, that this is a sanctioned commission event.
Yes.
You would be able to tell that. And if not, then what happens?
Well, then we could not issue a permit for the event. The event has to have a permit as well as the licenses that the participants have to obtain. The event itself has to have a permit.
But after, because I'm assuming the permit is coming before the actual match. Let's say a commissioner is showing up to the event and realizes that, okay, something's not what was submitted on paper is not actually what I'm seeing play out here, or something's off, that commissioner has the ability to shut the event down currently.
Yes. Again, in my 10 years on the commission, that has never happened. But I think it has happened in Virginia and Maryland in the past, and technically we could. That's obviously something that we would want to avoid at all costs. We have had a situation in the district during my tenure where a promoter who was putting on shows at DC Brow absconded with the bag, for lack of a better word, was not operating in good will, and basically disappeared.
Wow.
And individuals were not paid. I don't think some of the performers were paid. And this is the type of situation where the commission can and will revoke that individual's license. That individual will never promote a wrestling show in Washington again. We would not issue a license for them to do that.
You noted some of the steps that the commission has taken to reduce regulatory burdens, reducing fees, reducing the timeline for, I believe, health physicals, etc. How are you determining which regulations to ease? Walk me through that process. And then in terms of these big scale events, WWE comes to town, are they being taxed at the same rate that a DC Brawl would be taxed locally?
Probably at a higher rate. There's a television tax that also applies to televised events. So that would not apply to a DC Brow or a small independent event. There is a ticket tax that is associated with all events.
And what is that ticket tax?
I do not know that off the top of my head, but I can get with our staff and
Yeah,
provide you
if you
with that
could follow.
information.
But that ticket tax, I'm assuming, is the same rate regardless of the size of the
Yes,
event.
I believe that's correct.
And then for these other regulations that you've laxed, how did you arrive at easing those? Was it based on feedback, observation?
Yeah, it was largely based on feedback. You know, we hear from people. One of the things that I know sets us apart from other commissions, because many people have told me that, is that we are open and we're not trying to force our will upon anyone, for lack of a better phrase. We're open to working with our partners to help these shows be successful. It's not our main charge, but as ambassadors to the sport, you know, it's vital that we are connected with the folks that are putting on the shows and ask them what's working, what's not working. And then, of course, we always have to look to Virginia and Maryland to see what they're doing to try to keep the playing field as level as possible.
Understood. We heard reports today of, I think, problematic behavior on the part of commissioners or staff from the commission, as well as last minute requirements, whether it be for insurance or other things. Like, what are the insurance requirements for events? To level set?
Well, I'll say the insurance requirement was not a last minute requirement. It was a requirement. What the promoter of that event chose to tell Brandon or not, or if that person didn't know what they were doing, then that's a different situation. I think it was a last minute request to Brandon. I think that is the case, but that should have been.
But you would say that's the promoter's
That's the
fault.
promoter's responsibility.
And then what about the response that, hey, this $1,200 insurance that covers $10,000 is a fraction of what my insurance already covers? Why might there be an additional insurance requirement if the vendor already has insurance?
Yeah, so the current reg right now, and I'll just read it verbatim, for an event: insurance providing medical coverage for each contestant an amount approved by commission based on prevailing costs of medical treatment and circumstances of event, not less than $10,000. And that's the figure that Brandon quoted as well. In Virginia, the participants have to show that they're covered by health insurance. We don't have that requirement, but it's a way to, it's kind of getting at the same thing. Maryland requires a medical expense coverage of $5,000 and another $5,000 for death and dismemberment.
So again, $10,000.
Yeah, so we're aligned in the requirement. The way it went down at the DC Brow Show, I wasn't privy to that conversation that Brandon had. That was with a commission staff member who's no longer an employee of the district. The way that he described it to me was upsetting to me as well. And I would agree with his characterization that it was unprofessional. And even the appearance of something shady going on is enough.
But what about this point that, let's say he has $100,000 coverage,
right?
Would that not be sufficient? They have to take out additional insurance?
We're discussing that now, actually.
Okay.
With the commission staff at DLCP and with the general counsel at DLCP.
And are there any adjustments to the code that would be necessary for you all to make that change?
That I'm not sure about either, but we would definitely want to talk to you about that if that's the case. But this is something that we've already started a conversation with internally with the commission staff at DLCP.
Understood. In terms of that same story, the blank checks, is it customary that the commissioners or the staff is paid by the vendor?
It is, yes. And Brandon was referring to the physicians. These are all licensees of the commission, the physicians and the quote unquote officials. And by official, I don't mean a referee. That's part of the show. The official is the person that checks in the wrestler. The physician is the one who performs the pre-event.
What is the rate for the staff payment?
That I'll have to get to you as well. I don't think I have that in my binder. But that's the same across the board.
I was going to say, and so that would be the same whether it's the WWE event or a DC Brow event.
Correct. And the blank check, I think, was because it ends up getting made out to the individual licensee. I think that's why. But again, I recognize that being asked for 2 blank checks is probably not.
That definitely makes
the way that should have gone down.
Understood. And then we also heard complaints about just problematic treatment and conversation. Has that been on your radar? And what is the protocol there if you receive a complaint that commission staff or commissioners themselves are berating entertainment or something of the sorts?
Yeah, we have not received any official complaints from anyone about the behavior of commission officials. And I think that that's what Billy's referring to, Mr. Dixon, the officials, not the commissioners like myself and the staff, but our licensees, the folks who are checking in the wrestlers, the physicians who are seeing them. I learned about it through kind of the rumor mill and the city paper article that's been spoken about a few times. There's no question that it's highly inappropriate and unprofessional and unacceptable. And I don't have, there is no excuse that I could provide that would make any of that behavior.
What is the protocol internally? So let's say there's another article that comes out, or you sat through today's hearing and you heard these instances. Is there an internal process that you go through to investigate these reports of problematic behavior?
So that would all go through, because they're licensees, just as the wrestlers are, these officials are also licensees of DLCP. I believe it would go through the same process of any complaint. It would be referred to the investigative unit of DLCP to fact find, gather information, and then make a determination.
Now, that doesn't cut it. Now, with all due respect to my friends at DLCP, I think they have their work cut out trying to investigate illegal businesses that are operating in the city.
Yeah.
And shout out to them because they're cracking down on more of those.
Mhm.
But there has to be, for the commission, a process. And if one doesn't exist, I would highly recommend the commission exploring what might that look like. Whether that's an anonymous tip box, whether that's a survey protocol that you follow up with a vendor or the entertainers themselves, so that the commission has line in sight. Did our people leave a good representation for the commission itself? Just throwing that out there. But I hear you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate
That right now it seems like that may fall in DLCP's court.
yeah.
That wouldn't be satisfactory to me. And again, with all due respect.
Understood.
Okay, so I want to keep moving here. Talk to me about the application process. So a vendor wants to host an event. And can you just walk me through what steps they should be taking up until having that event?
Yeah, typically the way it works is, well, oftentimes a promoter will reach out to us informally, kind of as an introduction, especially if they're not local. We had this situation recently. There's a promoter who is interested in putting on some MMA events around the White House event in June. Had not worked with us in the past, so contacted us. We set up a Zoom call introductory meeting to learn more about them, what they had planned, what they wanted to do. As often happens, they ask us for feedback or ideas about venues, which we provide when we can. And then it's really up to them to secure a date and a venue. Once they have those two details confirmed, they can apply for a permit, an event permit.
And to do that, do they already have to have licenses in hand for the entertainers?
No, that can come before the event, 30 days before the event. All that has to be settled.
Got it.
Now, the promoter should have a promoter's license at the same time they're submitting their event permit.
And where does one get a promoter license?
Same, it's all through us. It's all through
you.
DLCP.
So they are getting a permit to host an event, a promoter license, and part of that they have to say, we will have the event at this venue. I'm assuming that's the big piece, a venue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's say it's at DC Brawl on Sunday, but this would probably be months in advance. Now you've given them the permit per se. Then what happens?
So then it's a process of, if it's a true professional boxing or MMA event, then there is a matchmaker that has to be licensed as well. And that individual will propose fights to the commission. We think that Joe Smith, who has a record of 20-1, should fight, Bill Brown, who has this record. And then the staff and myself will determine if we think that fight is appropriate based on the boxer's records, their age, any other information that we can gather.
So you all are even regulating who can actually be in a match together.
Yes, not in professional wrestling, but in true combat sports.
In boxing and MMA.
Yes, yes. And sometimes we will deny a fight because it's not a good fight. You don't want a guy who's 10-1 going up against a guy who's 0-20. And sometimes matchmakers will propose that. So there's a little bit of back and forth that goes on. And then when the card is settled, then it moves through the licensing of the participants. In boxing and MMA, it's not only the fighters that require a license, the managers, the seconds, which are the cut men or women, the folks who come in between rounds and treat and coach the boxer. So it's a process of.
And what about in professional wrestling? Is it just the entertainer that needs to be licensed there?
The promoter needs a license, and then the wrestlers themselves need licenses as well. Okay. Yes. And we also, there used to be a separate and more expensive license for a pro wrestling referee. And we've also lowered that to the price of a professional wrestler because the referee is not really refereeing. They're in fact part of the show. And
Got it.
for lack of a better word, they're wrestlers in their own right. They're moving around the ring, kind of controlling the
And
chaos.
would they get those wrestling licenses from you all as well?
Yes. Mhm.
So everything is coming through you all?
Yes, that's correct.
And then once they have that, then they're ready to go.
Then they're
They
ready
can
to go.
begin advertising and have the event.
Mhm.
Staff will show up on the day of the event, I'm assuming,
Mhm.
because now we also have reports that staff are late.
Mhm.
Do you all keep a record of how many shows are delayed or what time commission staff are showing up?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of anybody being late. But I'm not saying that didn't happen. I was just never made aware of it.
Okay.
I haven't heard
Are
of that
there
issue from
protocols
anyone
in
else.
place where you would know?
Well, I mean, if they're not there, then the wrestlers or the athletes aren't able to check in. And so that
Well,
would,
what we heard today was that while people are showing up for the show, they're rushing or being checked out. Again, going back to what I was saying, if there was a follow-up survey or review, that could be feedback that bubbles up to you. And it may just be a rogue staffer that, maybe we just need to tighten the reins on. A few other questions here. So this would exempt what is dubbed theatrical wrestling, although you take issue with that definition, for venues smaller than 2,000 seats. How many events a year are you licensing that would fall in that category of less than 2,000 seats?
for professional wrestling, few if any currently.
So right now there aren't many happening.
Correct. That's correct. We
Um,
do have wrestling that is occurring as part of other special events. So for example, as part of Art All Night, there's a promoter that will set up a ring on 9th Street. So, but like I mentioned,
But that wouldn't count in
right.
Got it. And are you able to follow up just with concrete numbers? Let's say over the last 5 years, how many licensed events fall under the category of less than 2,000 seats? And it may be zero, but if we can just formally have that number.
And you mean professional wrestling specifically?
Yes, professional wrestling, because that is what this would target in part. And then it defines amateur as someone who has never participated in boxing, martial arts, or professional wrestling for pay.
Yeah, that's a little confusing because typically in the industry, when you refer to amateur wrestling, you're referring to collegiate wrestling, which is a competition, University of Michigan versus Oregon. That's really what that is. And we don't have anything to do with that. So this idea of amateur versus professional doesn't really exist in the world.
But it also sounds like for the matches that are happening at a DC Brawl, for instance, the wrestlers or the entertainers are getting paid.
Correct. Yes.
So even that would fall outside of this definition.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think independent is really the right term to use. Independent professional wrestling to refer to the shows that, Billy wrestles in and that Brandon has hosted in the past. They're not one of the big 4 or 5 wrestling companies that tour the United States.
And how do you define amateur wrestling? Is that formally defined?
In our regs, I'm not sure. I don't think it is. I'll get back to you on that. I don't believe that it is defined in our regs as they currently are written.
Okay.
But you're either a professional wrestler or you're not. Whether if,
I hear
I
you
guess,
loud and clear.
if you've been doing it for 2 years, I guess you may be an amateur professional wrestler.
Let me ask it this way. Are there any exemptions in Maryland and Virginia that don't exist here around the amateur?
Like the independent?
Yes.
No, not that I'm aware of. No,
Okay.
no.
In terms of the pre-event checklist, so there is a pre-event medical checkup that is part of the process.
Mhm.
One report cited testimony that the pre-event medical checkups are often administered late, as I was mentioning, as fans are coming into the event.
Mhm.
Are these pre-medical checkups still happening
Yes.
before the event?
Yeah.
And what is the expectation for them?
So for example, when the John Cena event was in town, each wrestler has to see the doctor for,
That's a commission sanctioned doctor.
yes, yeah,
Yes.
commission licensed doctor, one of our physicians. And it's very quick. They'll ask them about their concussion history. They'll check their pupils for reactivity. They'll take their blood pressure, and they will perform some very basic strength tests. I would say in all, it takes probably 2 minutes tops.
Understood. And zooming back out, I hear you loud and clear. There are concerns you have about this legislation, both because you don't differentiate amateur or theatrical or independent wrestling from professional wrestling. It's all the same, because your argument is that risks are inherent. There are also consumer protection factors that we should keep in mind, as well as the health and safety of attendees attending these events. If not a separate classification by legislation, how can we work together to find additional ways for DC to be a friendly city to these independent wrestling events?
Well, I think that, we've heard from a couple of people already about the financial burden associated with putting these events on. And so, we've had discussions in the past with the council about this idea of a local promoters incentive fund, some small amount of money that can help the smaller independent promoters who are not well resourced like WWE and AEW to cover some of the costs of commission requirements. And by that, I mean EMS, having an ambulance on site for the show costs money. Things like that. I think that could be helpful and could potentially draw people back.
Because on average, a small producer that would host something, let's say a DC Brawl, on average, how much is it costing them to put on an event?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
But we know that they would have to get at least $10,000 in insurance, and they would have to pay for commission staff, in addition to whatever they're paying their own people.
Right. They'd have to rent the venue.
Okay. And you're going to follow up in terms of what the payment is for commission staff.
Yes.
Yes.
I've got that in my notes.
As well as the commission is looking at how you might build in flexibility for insurance, perhaps allowing vendors that already have insurance to be exempted from that.
Yes, correct.
In terms of the insurance requirement, is there a provider that vendors have to go through?
No.
No.
There are not. Again, I wasn't privy to the conversation that Brandon had.
So that example of you have to go to this guy in Dallas, Texas.
No, my understanding was that was a personal connection that
Understood.
former staffer had and was offering to facilitate
I got it.
between the two. But no, there is no
But
requirement. for a
normally the
specific
requirement, they could go to any insurance provider that would meet your requirements, and that would be satisfied.
That's correct.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to working with you, Chairman Huff, on this to see where we might be able to find synergy, because it seems like the intent of the bill you agree with, but some of the specifics you have concerns, namely around health and safety of the entertainers, but also district residents, which I think you raised very valid points.
Mhm.
I want to thank you for your testimony, and I also want to thank those that shared today. I do want to follow up on the instances that we heard about. And, I don't know if Mr. Dixon is still listening in, but it sounds like he had some examples he too was going to share with us and follow. I will be sure to follow up with you on
That'd be,
those.
all these individuals are licensees of the commission, and so we have expectations for how they operate and behave.
Well, that is going to conclude this portion of today's hearing. We will, as a committee, work with Councilmember Nadeau and your team to see how we might strike a compromise here. And I hear you loud and clear. There are supports that hopefully we can advocate for and secure through the budget that would make DC more attractive for these more smaller amateur independent events. So with that, I want to again thank all of today's witnesses. The next meeting on the Committee on Youth Affairs is currently scheduled for Thursday, April 2nd, when we will hold a public hearing on B26-0071, Uniform Unregulated Transfer of Child Custody Act of 2025, and B26-0479, the Youth Villages Grant Establishment Amendment Act of 2025. I look forward to the hearing and encourage members of the community to sign up to testify on these bills. With that, the business before the committee today is concluded. The time is now 4:21, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.